Hi everyone, GraphDBA here again with another video, and this is the third and final video in the series concerning cloning Oracle databases using the Dell Powerstore thin clone technology. But first, some boring legal stuff. All copyrights belong to their respective owners. Images and text owned by other copyright holders are used here under the guidelines of the fair use provisions of US copyright law. Said images and text are used here only for educational purposes and not for making money. I am not getting paid for doing this. I'm doing this on my own time. But when I do get paid, I work for Dell Technologies, where I am a principal engineer. That said, opinions expressed here are my own and do not necessarily represent Dell Technologies or any of its subsidiaries. Alright, the story so far. So on our Oracle One server, we had a database that used two ASM disk groups, swing data and FRA. With our Powerstore, we created a volume group including all of the disks of both disk groups. We then created a thin clone of our volume group and we mapped that to Oracle 2, where we added all the disks to our VM. We then renamed the ASM disk groups to clone swing data and clone FRA, as we already had a swing data and FRA on Oracle 2, and that would otherwise have caused a conflict. We then renamed the ASM disks within each of our clone disk groups, and finally we mounted the clone swing data and clone FRA disk groups. Then in the second video, we created a CloneDB instance, we created an init.aura file for the CloneDB, then we started the CloneDB instance, created an SP file, set the DB name, set the control files parameter, mounted the database, renamed the data files and the log files, and finally we opened the database. And then just for good measure, we did a refresh just to show that on the second go around, it is much simpler. And in this last video, we are going to delete CloneDB. In fact, we're not just going to delete CloneDB, we're going to delete the thin clone on which it is based and put everything back the way it was when we found it. So here's a diagram of how things are right now. We have our source database over in Oracle 1, and we have a thin clone mounted on Oracle 2 with our disk groups renamed to clone swing data and clone FRA. So why not just log into Powerstore and delete the thin clone? Well, that's a really bad idea, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, if you delete the thin clone, CloneDB will of course crash. But more than that, clone swing data and clone FRA will be left in a faulted state. You'll end up with orphan UDEV rules, and all of the above may cause problems later on if you ever want to recreate the CloneDB database. But more importantly than that, simply pulling away the thin clone can cause serious problems for VMware. There's a condition called all paths down, otherwise known as permanent device loss, and in certain scenarios this can cause ESX to crash. So what I'm going to show you is the proper way to delete the clone database and withdraw the ASM disk groups. So first, let me log into my Oracle 2 VM and show you that the CloneDB database is up and running. And then I'm going to source my environment, and I'm going to use server control to shut down CloneDB. That will ensure that any client sessions get a clean disconnect. And then I'm going to use dbca to delete the database. Now, if you saw my last video, you'll know that I did not recommend using dbca to create the database because it would create additional data files that we didn't need. But when we're deleting the database, dbca will help to ensure that all data files are cleaned up. That might be important if the clone has been in existence for some time, as you or other DBAs may have added additional data files, and you may not have limited them to the clone swing data and clone FRA or whatever ASM disk groups you started out with. dbca will delete the files regardless of where they are. Now, I've used a little video magic here to speed things along. The time that dbca takes to delete the database will depend on how many data files there are to clean up, but it's well worth taking this additional step to clean up the database properly. Now that dbca has finished deleting our database, we're going to connect as the grid user, source our environment to ASM, and then we are going to stop the clone swing data and clone FRA disk groups. Having stopped them, we will then further disable them, remove them, and drop them. Now, if we are just going to delete the thin clone, why are we going to all this trouble? Well, we want the grid infrastructure to purge all record of these disk groups, so that should we decide to recreate them again in the future, there will be no conflict between old settings and new. If you've ever spent an evening debugging a problem caused by the environment picking up obsolete settings instead of current ones, you'll appreciate this effort. But there's another reason for being this thorough. If the clone has been in existence for some time, you or another DBA might well have decided to place the data files of another unrelated database on the clone swing data or clone FRA disk groups, or whatever disk groups your clone is using. How would you know? Well, ASM won't let us offline an ASM disk group if it is actively being used by another database, so this approach ensures that there are no surprises. If we now log in as the root user and look in /dev/Oracle ASM, we will see the 4 clone swing data disks and the FRA disk. If we use ls with the AL flag, we'll see that they map to the SCSI devices K, L, M, N, and O. And if we use ls SCSI with the WWN flag, we can see the WWN IDs of our 5 disks. We can then use these to select the right RDM devices in VMware to detach from the VM. Now let's move over to vCenter and find our Oracle 2 VM. Open it up and select Edit Settings, and then let's take a look at the hard disks. Now in this example it is pretty simple. The 5 disks that we are looking for are the last 5 disks we added to the VM. So they will be disks 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. But we should still cross-check the physical LUN ID against the WWN IDs we recorded in Linux. So disk 15 ends with 252AF3. That's device SDO, one of the disks we are looking for. So we are going to select device will be removed, and we will also check delete files from the data store. Now this is an RDM, but even though RDMs are physical devices, VMware still creates a mapping file for each RDM on VMFS. So as we are deleting the volume in Powerstore, it is good practice to also delete the mapping files in VMFS. Now I'm going to skip a little bit of video here to save us some time, but we're going to repeat the same operations on disks 14, 13, 12, and 11, being sure to check the physical LAN IDs against the WWN IDs for each disk. When we're finished, we can click OK to delete the RDMs from the VM, and VMware will then reconfigure our VM for us. When VMware reports that VM2 has been reconfigured, we're going to log back into Linux just to double check that the devices that were removed were the devices that we expected to be removed. We can look at the ls/SCSI WWN flag and make sure that the devices that were part of clone swing data and clone FRA have indeed been removed, and that none of the other devices have disappeared. We can also restart the udev rules processor and then check the contents of /dev/Oracle ASM to make sure that all of the disks for the disk groups that we wanted to keep are all still present. If we have accidentally removed the wrong disks, be aware that they still exist on the Powerstore. We can put them back. So as much as we may have made a bunch of people very unhappy, we can actually get ourselves out of this mess. But we want to make sure that we've removed the right disks before we go ahead and start deleting things in Powerstore. Next, I'm going to delete the udev rules that we use for managing the devices for clone swing data and clone FRA. And now you might better appreciate why I like to keep the udev rules for the devices for each ASM disk group in a dedicated file. I don't have to edit an existing file, I just delete the relevant files completely. Next, we're going to log into our Powerstore, find our thin clone, and unmap it from the ESX cluster. Once we've unmapped it, we can go ahead and delete it. Now, if you wanted to be super careful, you could unmap it and then rescan the HBAs in VMware first, make sure that your VMs are all still running and your databases are operational before you finally delete the thin clone volumes. But we've already done a lot of checking to make sure that we've got the right volumes. So now that we've unmapped it, we'll go in and click More Actions, and we'll select Delete. That will delete the thin clone. It's also going to ask us if we want to get rid of the volume members, which we do. These are volume members based on the snapshot for the thin clone. So once it's deleted those, we'll go into vCenter and then rescan the HBAs to make sure that VMware is aware that the volumes no longer exist. So in vCenter, we'll select Storage, rescan Storage, and then again we'll deselect Scan for new VMFS volumes as we don't need that option. And when vCenter reports that the HBAs have completed the rescan operation, we are done with vCenter and we are done with Powerstore. But there's just one or two more little things that we need to do in Linux before we're finally done. So in Linux, I'm going to use server control remove database for clone_db. Now, this is probably redundant after what dbca did, but I like to cross every T and dot every I. Once I've done that, I'm going to check oracle home/dbs just to confirm that the init.aura and sp files have in fact been deleted. Then I'm going to check in the oracle base/admin directory, and I'm going to remove the directory for clone_db. That's where all the audit files and dump files went, and I want to clean that up as well. And lastly, I'm just going to double check that clone_db has in fact been removed from etc aura tab. And that is it. We are done. We have shut down clone_db, we've deleted our thin clone, and we put everything back exactly the way that we found it. Nobody will ever be any the wiser. Probably. Who knows? Anyway, to summarize, we shut down clone_db and we deleted the database with dbca. We dismounted, disabled, and dropped the clone swing data and clone FRA disk groups. We identified the WWN IDs of the disks in Dev Oracle ASM, and then we used that to remove the RDMs from the VM. We deleted the UDEV rules, we unmapped the volumes from within Powerstore, we rescanned the HBAs in vCenter, deleted the thin clone, and finally deleted the admin directory in Oracle Base. I hope you found that useful. If you liked it, maybe click like. If you really liked it, click subscribe. And if you want more of the GraphDBA wisdom, check out the blog at graphdba.wordpress.com. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again before too long.